with our coaches, we try to help them narrow the focus of what they want to coach and what they want the players to learn. And I think that's the superpower of tracking, is being able to say, we're working on playing through lines today. So I'm going to track how many times we break a line with a forward pass. And so I'm basically telling the players, this is what's important.
Welcome to the Cutting Edge Coaching Podcast, where we believe coaches are some of the most important teachers and leaders in the world, and they deserve to be supported. I'm your host, Luke Gromer, and every week we're bringing you conversations with coaches, experts, and leaders from across sports that will give you practical ideas and strategies that you can apply in your coaching to develop high-performing teams and high-character people. Coaches, I'm excited to welcome Max Dubane to the podcast. Max is a coach education manager for the New York Red Bulls youth teams, where he and his team are responsible for the education and development of 150 youth coaches in their club. In this episode, we talk about 5 teaching tools any coach can use. If you enjoyed this episode and want to grab a copy of the free podcast notes, just go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details to download a free PDF of notes from this episode or any episode of the podcast. And coaches, we just wrapped up our first annual summer coaching series, and you can get access to the video replays, audio-only replays, coaching notes, and more from all 12 sessions at summercoachingseries.com. Check out the incredible lineup of guests we had and what coaches had to say about their experience at summercoachingseries.com. And one note about this episode before we hop in. This conversation was recorded live at a coaching convention, so there may be a bit of background noise at times, but we did our best to edit the audio to bring you the highest quality possible. Now to my conversation with Max Dubane. Enjoy the episode. Coach is really excited to welcome Max Dubane to the podcast. Max is the coach education manager for the New York Red Bulls youth teams. Max, welcome to the podcast. And to start, will you just share a really quick bio about your coaching journey and then just a little bit more about your role currently?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, Luke. So started with Red Bulls about 9 years ago, and I kind of got into it accidentally, just going to take a coaching course for the first time with a buddy of mine, not really thinking about coaching, but just something to do. I love the game and wanted to keep it as part of my life. And on the course, it ended up being a couple of Red Bull coaches that were the instructors. So the course ended. They said, "Hey, would you be interested in applying for a job?" I said, "Yeah, why not?" And got on board with them kind of as a junior coach, which is what we call like an assistant coach. Didn't have any coaching experience at the time, and kind of worked my way up the ladder there, and came on as a part-time coach, and then eventually a full-time coach, and moved into kind of like an admin position / coaching position, and now into a coach education position. And so as a coach educator, what I do here is we have about 150 grassroots coaches that work within the communities in New York, New Jersey. And between myself and a few other coach developers, we're in charge of the education and development of those 150 grassroots coaches.
That's awesome. And I want to dive into now the list of 5 teaching tools that you mentioned to me. I'm going to list all 5 of those tools really quickly, and then we'll just start diving into the first one. Number 1, incentives. 2, tracking. 3, demonstrations. 4, questioning. And 5, checking for understanding. I love these tools. Excited to talk about them. And let's start with incentives. What or how can coaches... Actually, let me back up. Butchered that. Let's start with incentives. First of all, what are they and how can we use them effectively in our teaching and coaching?
Yeah, sure. So incentive is basically something like a rule or a condition that you could put on an activity that hopefully brings out the behavior that you're looking for without kind of forcing it. So maybe you give it extra value. So for example, you could say, a forward pass is worth 2 points, where a sideways pass or a backwards pass is only worth 1 point. So we like to differentiate incentive versus a rule, because a lot of times what you hear, and especially in youth coaching, is in technical activities, maybe it will be, oh, you can only use your left foot, or you can only use the inside of your foot. But what ends up happening is when the kids are in activities or game-like environments, maybe the right decision is to use the part of the foot that you're telling them not to. So maybe I want the players to practice using the outside of their foot a little bit more, because everything that they do is with the inside of their foot. So I could say, okay, the rule is you have to use the outside of your foot, but now I'm taking away the decisions from them. Now they have to do that. So instead, what I might say is that if you make the pass with the outside of your foot and we score a goal off of it, that goal is worth double. And so now they still have the option to make a real decision as they would in the game. If the inside of the foot is the right pass to make, they can make that. But then they're going to be looking for moments to use the outside of the foot because they know that it's incentivized and there's more value on it.
I love this. And I love that example because it's so important to choose the right incentives or constraints, rewards to, again, like you said, try to elicit that behavior or the application of that skill that we want to see. And I think, like you mentioned, one of the easiest, best ways to do it is just to adjust the scoring of whatever game you're playing. Like you said, all right, a normal goal, it's worth 1, still valuable. But right now, if you can score in this way, it's double. And it's important that the way that we're going to reward is a way that we know is going to long-term serve them the most, right? In their development as a player or as a team, or even it's most like what they're going to experience in the game, right? That incentive we choose is going to bring that out and be focused on helping them learn and grow the things they need to be successful now and in the future.
Yeah, 100%. I kind of look at it as like small, subtle pushes within the session without kind of forcing it, right? Because you want them to be able to make those decisions. And, it doesn't always necessarily need to be around the scoring, but you can also do it with kind of what you praise, right, as a coach. So maybe I want the players to play forward, or I want the players to try to find gaps and play through those gaps. And, a way of being really narrowed and focused, and we'll talk about it when we talk about tracking, but a way to be narrow and focused is to praise those behaviors and kind of maybe be a little bit more silent when you see some other behaviors that are also okay, but not exactly what you're focusing on during that session.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's another great point there too. Any other thoughts or things you would share on incentives that we should be thinking about as coaches?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's fun about coaching is that when you're creating sessions and when you're planning is a chance to be creative. So it doesn't need to be, okay, if I'm working with an attacking team on passing, the incentive doesn't necessarily need to be around passing. Maybe I incentivize the defending team. If you win the ball in the attacking half of the field and you score, that's double the points. So now it's going to put some more pressure on the team that maybe you want to work with. Maybe they're working on building out of the back, and so now they have to build out of the back under pressure.
Yes, I like that a lot too. Essentially invert what you want to see happen. So if I coach basketball, so one of the easiest ways to think about this for me in basketball, coaches hate giving up offensive rebounds, right? Giving another team a second chance point is what it's called. And so if you reward, if you want your team to get better at boxing out, securing defensive rebounds, well, then just reward offensive rebounds. Because then now all of a sudden the offensive players are going to crash the glass harder to try to rebound. And inevitably the defense has to direct more of their attention to stopping this thing just because we incentivized it.
Yeah, exactly. And, it just starts by thinking about what's the behavior or what's the outcome that you're trying to get out of the session. And then you can plan backwards from there and say, okay, what are a couple of different incentives that I could have in my pocket to play with? And, you try them in sessions and maybe they work, maybe they don't, maybe it's not exactly what you wanted, but it's okay. You learn from it and you just adjust from there.
Yeah, that's really good. And incentives are so important. Going to tool number 2, tracking, and you kind of already alluded to it previously, but let's talk more about that. What is tracking? Why is it so important?
Yeah, so tracking is a more objective method of kind of observing the game, I guess you could say. And something I personally just started to play with a little bit more over the last year or two and get a little bit deeper into. And so, there are many ways to track, and you can track a million different things. But, with our coaches, we try to help them narrow the focus of what they want to coach and what they want the players to learn. And I think that's the superpower of tracking, is being able to say, we're working on playing through lines today. So I'm going to track how many times we break a line with a forward pass. And so I'm basically telling the players, this is what's important. And so I'm going to tell them, okay, guys, we've played for 4 minutes. We've broken the line 3 times. It's not bad. Let's try a couple of details here, a couple of coaching points here. Second round, maybe we break the line 4 times. That's improvement, right? And I think when you frame it that way to the players, it's really clear what you're trying to work on, what your objective is, and it's clear for the coach, it's clear for the players.
That's so important. I absolutely love what you shared there around trying to be more objective, ultimately with our feedback, but that starts with tracking and collecting some data. I'm curious, in your work educating coaches, supporting them, that's not necessarily a traditional way to coach, to maybe have a clipboard or something where you're actually just watching and you're tracking some things. And maybe you're doing some intervention and coaching as well, but one of your primary things that you're doing is observing and tracking. Do you have coaches that are resistant to that? And if so, how do you get them to embrace the importance of that?
Yeah, I think like most coaching tools, it's a skill, right? So it's something that's going to be challenging for a coach at the beginning, because you're trying to watch the session, you're trying to track something at the same time. You have a session to coach, you have kids to manage, you have other teams next to you, have a bunch of things going on. So yeah, it can be challenging, but like any skill, the more you work at it, the better you're going to become at it. And I think there are some tips and tricks you can kind of use to navigate the tracking system. So a couple of things you can do are, let the players do the tracking during the session, depending on the activity, right? So I'll show an activity tomorrow on the field, which will be like a little 5v2 rondo, and I'm going to incentivize a split pass. And if they split, they're going to get a point for that. But also I want them to track how many times they get a point from splitting. But I'm going to have them count that. So I'm just going to put a player in charge and say, okay, Luke, you're the captain. You're going to be in charge of counting how many times we split. And so when the round ends, hopefully I'm going to get a number from all the different teams. Can't track all of them at the same time, right? But the players can track for me. So, that's a method. We have, you ever see those baseball clickers where they do like pitch count, right? So I've used one of those before. You could use those, walk around with it in your pocket, so you don't need to remember the number. You just have it, and then you can look at your clicker at the end. For a lot of our grassroots coaches, they have parent coaches that are around the fields with them, and that's a great role for the parent coach, to give them a job and make them feel important, and also add some value to the training session to say, hey, we're tracking completed and incompleted passes today. This is what a complete pass looks like. This is what incomplete pass looks like. Do you mind tracking that for me? And most of the time they're going to say yes.
Yeah, that's really good there. I think it's really important that you find a method of tracking, one that's manageable, that doesn't take up all of your working memory and mental capacity. And one of the things that I found is it's just important to give, if you're going to be doing the tracking, give yourself some structure ahead of time. And again, that comes back to us being focused as a coach to keep them focused. But what am I tracking and how am I going to track it, right? So am I tracking completed and incompleted passes? Am I just going to do like dash marks in this T chart to track it? Like, doing some of that, I think, is really important on the front end to make sure that you do have kind of the capacity to track well when you're actually in the heat of the practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been a number of times where I've gone into a session planning to track something, and then you kind of lose it because you're focused on the coaching and you forget the tracking, and that's okay. But over time, I've become better at it, and as coaches, we'll become better at it if we just implement it.
Yeah, because the reality is we forget just as fast as our players do. And like you were talking about with the baseball pitch counter, like you've got to have something so that we just remember. Yeah. And I think that's one of the other reasons tracking is so important, right? our mind's so limited, got to write it down so that we can come back to it if it's really worth our time and attention to do so. I want to go into tool number 3, demonstrations, and let's talk about this. When should we as the coach demonstrate versus when should we have players demonstrate? And the other piece of that is, when we do demonstrations, how do we make sure they're engaging and intellectually stimulating for everybody, not just the player doing the demo or ourselves doing the demo?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I'm not sure there's a right answer to this. There's definitely different methods to it, but I think especially with youth players, they should be doing the demos as much as possible. As long as they can, they should be doing it. So I think the role for the coach is maybe when you're demoing a technique and you need to show a really, really high quality example of that technique that you know that you can provide, and maybe the players can't provide consistently. So maybe you're trying to break down a technique for them and you want to demo that to show them that. Another time I think it's important for the coach to demo is when you're implementing a new idea. If the players have never seen it before, it's going to be hard for them to demo it just from listening to your words, right? So maybe you're teaching a tactic or you're teaching a player to kind of like show underneath the striker. Okay, the ball's being played into the striker. I want you to move underneath into this space. Maybe they've never seen that or heard of that before. So I think that's an opportunity for the coach to step in and just show them the movement, show them the timing. Once they see it once or twice, then they'll start to be able to experiment with it. And that's when you can step in as a coach and start to help correct them and help teach them what you want them to learn. So I would say, technique, when you want to show a really good example or any kind of new tactic, is a great opportunity for the coach to step in. And then other than that, I would say give it to the players, right? It's the players' games. The players are the ones that are going to have to do it on game day, right? So let the players play. And if you have to do it in slow motion, that's okay. But I'd say let the players demo.
Yeah, I think that's good. A good advice, good rule of thumb there. I would also say this around player demos. Totally agree. If it's the first time, that's a great time for a coach to demo something, obviously, because you want to show them something specific in a demo. But when you come back to that the next time, next practice or the practice after that, and you probably need to demo it again because they've forgotten it, that I think is a great time to have players demonstrate, because not only are they demonstrating they're actively engaged, but it's a great time to essentially do some retrieval practice. So Max, step out here. I'm going to have you demonstrate this. And okay, Max, what's the first thing we're going to do? Or even maybe I'm actually not questioning Max. Max is doing the demonstration and I'm questioning the other athletes that are watching it. Or maybe there's multiple athletes doing the demonstration and I'm questioning some of them in it or some of them outside of it. I think that can be another really effective way to do demonstrations is just to think about, okay, I might need to demo this again if it's not something we've really learned yet. And when I demo it, let's use some intentional questioning here to make sure I engage those athletes that are demoing it and those that aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to get multiple players involved in the demonstration, right? I like to call it like a walkthrough, and especially when you're showing how an activity works, I think a lot of times what we see is coaches will get players in a huddle before the activity. They'll explain the activity to them, and then they'll put them out on the field, expect them to know what to do, but they don't understand it. So inevitably what happens is they need to explain it again, but now the players are in their positions. So instead, let's just skip that first step of getting them in the huddle, put them on the field where you want them, let the ball move as you talk through the activity. Okay, ball moves from the center back to the striker. 10, can you come underneath? Drop it to the 10. Good. And just explain it as the players are doing it. So you're hitting the audio, you're hitting the visual, you're hitting the kinesthetic for some of the players that are involved in the demonstrations, and it can be an effective tool.
Talk through, walk through. There you go. If you get nothing else from this conversation, I think that's totally worth it. The inner demonstrations, talk it through, walk it through. I think what a great tip there. It's like you said, I'm guilty of it too. We're in a huddle. All right, guys, we're about to go out and do this. I need this, 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 and this. Go. And it's not even close to what we wanted. We overloaded their mind. It wasn't clear. So I love what you shared there. Talk through, walk through. That's so important. And let's hit teaching tool number 4 now, questioning. Talk to me about the different types of questions that we can and should use with our players.
Okay, yeah. So listen, there's going to be a lot of crossover between all these different teaching tools, and I guess the intention is for them all to be used simultaneously in a session, right? It's not like you're only using one teaching tool, but I think questioning is important. Working with youth players to turn their minds on and to keep them actively engaged, like you said. So talk about closed questions or open questions. Closed questions are basically questions where you have a choice between two answers. A lot of times we'll see them as yes or no questions. And when you ask players a yes or no question in front of the whole group, most of the time, unless you have a really bold player, you're going to get yes, because all they want to do is play. So the classic question we joke about is, does that make sense? And the answer is always going to be yes.
Or do you have any questions?
Right. Do you have any questions? And the answer is going to be no, because all they want to do is play. So a little bit more effective is probably asking open questions, which are questions that are requiring an explanation from the player. So a lot of times we'll use this when we're checking for understanding, and you might say, Luke, can you just remind me how you score a point? And then now you need to explain to me how you score a point, and that lets me know that you understand the game. So, and using that when you're coaching as well, not just for checking for understanding, but when you're making some coaching points, can also be effective because you're just getting the player's perspective. So, Luke, what did you see in that last play is a better question than, do you think that was good?
Yeah, absolutely. So important that we're intentional with our questions, because I think most coaches recognize the importance of asking questions, but if you don't ask the questions well, they can be kind of counterproductive, and I think they can really undermine your culture that you're trying to create too. If you ask a bunch of closed questions that don't actually force your athletes to engage mentally, to give you a thoughtful response, one, it's just going to be a lot harder to assess what they've actually learned. But then two, it really ends up over time sending this message of, the questions I ask aren't that important, because you don't really have to think when I ask you a question. Just give me the response, right? And move me on it. And I think that segues into the next part of questioning well, which is, talk to me about how coaches can ask questions effectively to ensure that everybody is engaging mentally with it and accountable to respond. Really, I think what we're getting at here is like means of participation. What are the different ways that we can solicit responses to questions effectively?
Yeah. It's really important, and a lot of times what you find is you'll get 2 or 3 players in your group that are willing to always answer the question. If you just leave it open to the whole group, you're going to get the same 2 and 3 players, and that could trick you as a coach to think that the whole group understands, but really it's always those same 2 or 3 players that are understanding. So, some tools and some methods to use is potentially cold calling different players, and depending how you want to structure the question, I can structure the question by maybe starting with your name by saying, Luke, can you remind me how you score a point? And just by saying your name first, it's going to kind of switch you on to say, this is coming from me, I need to pay attention. But also what it might do unintentionally is switch off the rest of the group. They know it's not coming to them. So again, these are tools for us to use as coaches to decide when's the right time to say, can you remind me how to score a point, Luke? Or Luke, can you remind me how to score a point? And I think that's one of the effective tools to use. I also really love asking players to raise their hand. And especially with younger players, if you have a group of them and you have a question for them and you say, okay, just raise your hand before you answer this, pose the question, you'll probably get half the group raise their hand. And then you say, I'll give you 5 more seconds if your hand's not up to just think about the question. And that's giving them some time to say, wow, the coach actually cares about me answering the question.
Yeah.
And a lot of times what you'll find is the rest of the hands will go up. And then when you ask one of those kids that put their hands up late, you're usually going to get a great answer. But basically what you've done is just given them an extra chance to say, let me actually think about this, because a lot of times they're not really thinking about it.
Yeah, that's great. And I think 2 things there. The first, on cold calling or calling on players randomly. The first thing is, I think it's really important that we tell them it's going to happen. Hey, I want you to know, I'm going to call on you randomly in this practice. It's and that we don't use it as a gotcha. Like, I'm not going to call on you randomly to try to get you, like for not paying attention or not focusing. It's not for that. I'm going to call on you randomly. If you don't know the answer, that's okay, and we'll figure it out together here. But know that it's going to happen. And teachers, coaches, I think, can be like, oh, but people don't like being called on. People don't like talking in front of the group. Yes, that can be true, but when it's the norm, when it's the way that you do it in your learning environment, it's not a big deal. Like,
Yeah.
in my classroom, on my teams, I cold call, or use a random number generator where, based on their seat number, like, that's who's going to answer the question, right? And it becomes the norm, and you create an environment where it's safe. Like, it's safe to give a wrong answer here. You might answer this question incorrectly, and that's okay. It's actually good. We'll get to learn from it here. And so I think it's really important with cold calling that we roll it out, and that we let them know that it's okay if they answer incorrectly, if we call on them. And then the other piece that you were talking about with raising hands, I think, is also really, really good and important. And it's important, and you said it very subtly, that we give them the means of participation before the question. I'm about to ask you a question. I want you to, don't shout at the answer, raise your hand, right? Or, hey, I'm about to ask a question. Let me ask the whole question, and then you're going to turn to someone standing next to you, and you're going to talk for 30 seconds. Then I'm going to call on one group randomly. Just like, tell them how they're going to participate, and make sure it's a way where everybody's accountable for learning and thinking, like you said, whether it's a raised hand, whether it's a cold call, a turn and talk to a partner. I think it's really important when we think about questioning that we get clear on those means of participation, because, again, like you said at the beginning of questioning, too often we just hear from the same 2 or 3 athletes that feel confident and competent to share a response to our questions.
And that's kind of not really who we need to hear from, right? We know that they have it. We know that they understand it. It's the other players that we need to make sure the learning is getting through to them. And I think, you mentioned not using it as a gotcha, and I think that's a great point. And if you do use it correctly over time, it just becomes part of the culture, part of the team culture. The players expect it all the time. And really what you're saying as a coach is that I value everybody's opinion, and I want you all to think. And I think that's really powerful and really important. And you'll get that back from the players if they feel that trust from you.
Absolutely. And hopefully that's the kind of environment we're trying to create, where everybody feels valued, seen, heard, like that they're a part of this process, a valuable part of it, because they are. And like you said, we've got to deploy some of these strategies to make sure that we're actually hearing every voice. And that kind of leads into the 5th teaching tool. And we've kind of hit on it a little bit throughout our conversation, but checking for understanding. This is obviously really important, a really important part of the teaching and learning process, but honestly, really hard too, especially coaching team sports. Like, it is hard to know where everyone is all the time, and we can't even necessarily know that all the time. But let's talk about checking for understanding. What should we as coaches be thinking about or doing to effectively check for understanding?
Yeah, I like to break it into 2 pieces. One is questioning for understanding. The other one is observing for understanding. So, you could do it while you're giving the rules to an activity. You could do it when you're making a coaching point. You could do it over time, over the course of a season. You want to understand if the players are starting to pick up the concepts that you're trying to teach. And really effective method is using these open questions to ask the players, can you remind me what our main attacking principle is? And, maybe we're 3 or 4 weeks into the season. And if half the players can't tell you that, then that probably means that you've been missing something over those past 3 or 4 weeks. And okay, a chance for you to reflect as a coach and say, what was I doing? What can I do a little bit different now to make sure that the players are starting to pick this up? So it's a good barometer for us as coaches to understand what's actually getting through to the players and what are they understanding.
That's really good. I really like what you talked, that example you shared there of using questioning to, assess what they've actually learned, maybe the language that has been actually encoded in long-term memory, the principles of play that we think we've been teaching and emphasizing that maybe haven't really landed yet. And really, it's so powerful and important because that's just another piece of retrieval practice of remembering stuff that we've taught to hopefully then actually make it stick. So I think it's really important that even if it's just 90 seconds at the end of your practice to cold call, popcorn around, and check for understanding on what you did in that session.
Yep.
Max, remind me, what is our point of emphasis in the final third, Max, right? Or whatever it is, but to quickly quiz them essentially on those concepts, language terms, whatever it is, to reinforce that learning because ultimately we want them to remember it. If they don't remember it, they haven't learned it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you mentioned, it may take 90 seconds. And I think that's some of the hesitation from some of the coaches is they just want to get the session started quickly, and they don't want to waste time. But what ends up happening is if you don't check for understanding, most of the times you end up spending the time later, right? With the ball not rolling and you having to explain something to them. So taking the couple of extra seconds in the beginning of the session or the beginning of the activity could be worth it in the long run because you're actually going to save time.
And that's a great point because, I was referencing the end of practice, and that's probably an area for me personally where I can get better is actually the beginning of practice is a great time for a quick retrieval practice, quick check for understanding about what you addressed last time. I'm a classroom teacher too. One of the, foundational things I was taught in my teacher education was the importance of the technical term for it was an advanced organizer, which was essentially, the beginning of your lesson is a quick review or retrieval of what you did in the class previously. And I think that's a really simple way that as coaches, we can just begin to cement learning more often. If you're willing to commit 60 to 90 seconds at the beginning of your practice and at the end of practice to just quickly do a verbal review, I think we'd all be surprised how much more sticks.
Yeah, and combining these tools, right? We were talking about tracking earlier, and we were talking about narrowing the focus. And if you can work on narrowing the focus as a coach and using check for understanding skills habitually, it becomes much more clear to the players, and you're kind of reducing that forgetting habit after you just taught something, and maybe you come back the next session and you start the session with a little CFU, and that helps kill that forgetting curve.
Yeah, absolutely. Got to fight forgetting. I think, yeah, gosh, it is a never-ending fight forgetting for us too, and for them. Well, Max, this has been fantastic. Before I get you out of here, I've got 3 quick rapid-fire questions for you. Just
Sure.
want to know the first thing that comes to your mind. The first one is this: the most fun part of coaching is?
I love the team culture aspect of coaching. That's my favorite part of coaching is just being able to create this bond between all of these players and you as a coach, and somewhere where they enjoy coming and learning and having fun and being challenged and being competitive, and players will remember that for the rest of their life. And I remember someone said to me once that I was coaching a U8 group, and it was like the coach said to me, I was with them for a couple of years, and the parent coach said to me, this was their first experience with a coach, and that was a great experience for them. And you defined what a coach is. I had never thought about it that way. We all have that opportunity when we work with kids to define what a coach is to them. And that could either be a great experience or not so great experience. So
I love that. That's such a great example. Thanks for sharing. Here's the next one. I wish I would have known blank before my first coaching experience.
Wow. I'm not sure I would be where I am if I knew blank. I think we all need to go through that journey of struggling and not knowing what we're doing and kind of failing, and then starting to figure it out little by little.
Yeah. Is there, and maybe there's not, I agree with you on that, but is there one thing that comes to your mind of like, man, this was a light bulb moment for me. When I realized this, it changed a lot.
Yeah, I think maybe giving the players more autonomy. I think as I've grown as a coach, I've learned that the role of the coach is to help the players be autonomous and solve the problems themselves, play the game themselves. And I think in the beginning, there's always going to be a little bit of ego, and you're the coach and you're trying to make sure that your message gets across, and it's a little bit more about you than it is about the players. And it shouldn't be that way. It should be the opposite way, right? It's all about the players, and let them take over the game, and you're there to help them and guide them because you have the expertise.
That's really good. Here's my last rapid fire question for you. I know I'm successful as a coach when?
Yeah, when the players want to come to practice every day. think it's that simple.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know it too. You can see it.
Yeah.
And they're excited to be there.
They're not all going to be pro players, right? And that's not the goal, but the goal is for hopefully them to be lifelong players. And as they become adults, they're still playing in adult leagues, or maybe they're coaching, or they're involved in the game in some way. And I think that's what success looks like.
That's awesome. Well, Max, this has been fantastic. Before we hop off, just share with the listeners where they can connect with you.
Yeah, you can just find me on LinkedIn on Max Dubane on LinkedIn, and I don't have any other social media, so keep it pretty simple and straightforward in LinkedIn. And you can find me in New York, New Jersey area with New York Red Bulls.
That's awesome. Max, thanks a ton for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luke.
Coaches, thanks for listening to this episode, and thanks to Max for joining me. As always, if you enjoyed the episode and you want to grab a copy of the podcast notes, just go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details to download a free PDF of notes from this episode. My practical takeaway from today's episode is Max's walkthrough strategy for demonstrations. Have your players walk through something new while you talk them through it. And I'd add that it can also be helpful to prep a small group of athletes before practice for a demonstration. Essentially, do a walkthrough with them before the actual one during practice. It'll just make the demonstration better for everyone in the group if the group demonstrating has done it once before. And coaches, don't forget to check out summercoachingseries.com to learn more or get access to our 2022 Summer Coaching Series. Thanks for listening to the podcast.